The storm didn't kill them. That was the cruelty of it. December 1877. The American schooner Sally M. Steelman was running a familiar route off Cape Hatteras, that jagged finger of North Carolina coast that sailors had long named the graveyard of the Atlantic, not for poetry, but for the body count. Two ocean currents collide there, the cold Labrador current pressing south, the warm Gulf Stream pushing north. Between them, they manufacture weather that is sudden, extreme, and indifferent to whoever happens to be in the middle of it. On this particular December night, the sea decided the Steelman was finished. The storm struck in darkness, which is always worse. No warning silhouette on the horizon, no time to reef sails or batten hatches, or do any of the small, practical things sailors do to remind themselves they have some control. Just a wall of wind and black water that arrived without introduction and did not stop until the ship was unrecognizable. Rigging draped like torn cloth, hull groaning its particular low note, the sound a vessel makes when it is considering surrender. When dawn came, gray, flat, the sun a pale smear behind clouds that offered no warmth, the crew of the Steelman were alive. That was the full extent of their good fortune. The stores of food had been destroyed or swept overboard, the ship was drifting, engines useless, sails gone, no way to steer toward anything. The horizon looked the same in every direction, empty, cold, absolute. And the calendar began its count. You have to understand what hunger actually does to a person, not in the comfortable way we use the word said at noon before lunch, but the real version. By day 3, the stomach stops sending polite signals and begins a kind of internal clawing. By day 7, the body starts consuming itself, converting muscle to energy with a mechanical desperation. And the mind, the intricate, morally structured, carefully socialized human mind, begins to do something that no one discusses at dinner tables. The borders of acceptable thought start quietly moving. Not dramatically, not with alarm bells, just slowly, incrementally, the way a shoreline erodes. Things that lived in the category of impossible begin drifting, gently, toward merely difficult, not as desires, just as options, laid out with a terrible, patient logic. The crew of the Steelman had worked together long enough to know each other, names, habits, the rhythm of a shared watch in the dark hours before dawn. Now they sat in the ruins of their ship and felt that knowing shift into something for which none of them had a name. The familiarity between men who are starving is not warmth, it is something else entirely. What happened in the specific hours leading to the breaking point was never fully reconstructed. Hunger distorts memory as efficiently as it distorts morality. What survived in the historical record, in court papers, in newspaper accounts published across the American coast, was the outcome. Sometime in the third week of drifting, one sailor raised a pistol and shot another man dead. The sound of a gunshot on the open ocean is enormous and then immediately swallowed, a single crack, the echo dissolving over flat gray water, and then a silence that was qualitatively different from any silence before it. A crewman named Barrett did what came next. The record is specific because Barrett himself later described it to reporters who arrived with notebooks and the particular hunger of men paid to find out the worst of things. The body was butchered. Some of it was eaten raw. Fire was unreliable on the damaged ship. Other portions were cooked over whatever flame could be managed. The men ate to survive because eating was the only remaining option, and survival was the oldest and most insistent instruction their bodies knew how to give. When journalists asked Barrett to describe the experience, they expected something: collapse, horror, the visible wreckage of a man who had done something irreversible. What they received instead was the thing that made this story travel across every American newspaper that ran it. Barrett described the taste as comparable to good beefsteak, without distress, without visible remorse. The way you might describe a meal you remembered fondly from a trip somewhere, matter of fact, calm, almost cheerful. That single detail hit the American reading public like a cold wave. Not the violence. The violence could be filed under desperation, under the unknowable pressure of starvation, under circumstances no one at a breakfast table could truly imagine. What could not be so easily filed was the calm, the complete functional absence of horror in a man who had just crossed a threshold that everyone agreed was absolute. Behavioral science offers an explanation that is, in its own way, more disturbing than the act itself. Under sufficient duress, the human brain is capable of partitioning, of sealing the moral weight of an experience behind a door that remains locked for as long as survival requires it. The mechanism is not a malfunction, it is a feature. It exists in all of us, dormant, waiting for conditions most of us will never encounter. Barrett's mind didn't break. It performed exactly as designed. It found a way to continue. The horror isn't in the man, the horror is in the recognition. The survivors were found weeks later by a passing vessel, the Steelman still adrift, still wearing the shape of a ship even as it was barely one. The crew were lifted out, gaunt, quiet, carrying in their eyes the particular flatness of people who have been somewhere the rest of the world hasn't. They were brought to shore, they were fed, they gave accounts, they were not prosecuted. Maritime law at the time had no framework for what had occurred, and the courts, perhaps wisely, or perhaps simply gratefully, let ambiguity do what judgment could not. Barrett returned to something like ordinary life. He ate meals, he walked streets. Whether the memory surfaced in the smell of cooking meat, in the specific sensation of deep hunger, in the quiet seconds before sleep, the record doesn't say. He left no further testimony. The Steelman was recovered, logged as a navigational hazard, towed to harbor, and dismantled. The ocean accepted the remainder. But the question the ship left drifting behind it has no such clean resolution. On day 1, you are who you believe you are. On day 15, you are whoever hunger decides. Somewhere between those 2 points is a line you were certain, architecturally, fundamentally certain, you would never cross. Barrett found his line. He stepped over it. He described the other side as tasting like beefsteak. And the thing that should sit with you long after this story ends is not the violence, it's the word good. As good as any beefsteak he ever ate. Not just survivable, good. As though the moral weight of what he had done, the thing that would have crushed you or me to contemplate, had simply ceased to exist, reclassified, dissolved by need into something the mind could handle without flinching. The number of days exists in all of us. Most of us will never learn it. We should count that as a mercy. The sea off Cape Hatteras keeps most of its secrets well. It kept most of theirs, but this one escaped, onto the front pages, into the archives, and now into this quiet moment you're sharing with it. The ocean doesn't judge. It never has. It just waits and remembers and keeps its count. The ship had been dying for 3 weeks before they decided to kill the boy. December 1835. The Irish vessel Francis Spaight was crossing the North Atlantic on a route that should have been unremarkable, a voyage made thousands of times on waters charted for centuries. But the North Atlantic in winter answers to no chart and no schedule. The storm that found the Spaight found it completely, stripping the masts, flooding the lower decks, washing most of the provisions overboard in great dark sheets of water that took whatever was loose and gave nothing back. The ship didn't sink. That would have been in some ways the more merciful outcome. Instead, it became a hulk, mastless, drifting, unsteerable on a grey winter ocean that received their distress signals with total silence. No passing ships, no visible coast, nothing but the slow, wet, exhausting work of staying alive on a vessel that was no longer truly a vessel. Captain Gorman kept order for as long as order was something men were willing to maintain. The first days of survival after a catastrophic storm carry their own dark momentum, bailing, patching, rationing, the grim solidarity of people who have survived something together and are still running on the adrenaline of it. But adrenaline doesn't feed a person. The days passed, the food ran out, and the particular silence that descends on a group of starving men in the middle of the ocean, that silence began. The Spaight was carrying several cabin boys among its crew, young men, teenage years, placed aboard ships the way young men of limited means were placed in circumstances that treated their lives as casually adjustable. They were the lowest in the hierarchy. They had the least influence, the least experience, the fewest advocates aboard. They were, in the brutal mathematics of a failing ship, the most expendable. By the 3rd week, with no rescue in sight and nothing left to eat, Captain Gorman gathered his crew. What happened next was not spontaneous, not the product of a single moment of terrible impulse. It was a discussion, a decision, made collectively with the grim procedural deliberateness of men who had decided to frame the unframable as an administrative matter. A lottery would be held among the 4 cabin boys. The one who drew the short lot would be sacrificed. The word lottery is doing significant work in that sentence. It implies fairness, it implies chance, the cold neutrality of probability, the removal of personal decision from personal action. If the lots decide, no individual man has to be responsible for the deciding. This is the psychology that has made lotteries of this kind recur across maritime history with disturbing frequency, not because they are moral, but because they provide a structure that makes the immoral feel procedurally defensible. If everyone agrees to the rules become the villain. The boys would have understood what was happening. They were young, but not so young that the meaning was unclear. The men who had been their shipmates, their superiors, the authority figures of their working lives, had decided in open discussion that one of them would not be leaving the ship alive. The lots were drawn. One boy's hand came up with the short straw. He was 17 years old. That detail surfaces in some accounts. 17, signed onto a merchant ship in the way that boys of limited options did, with the vague understanding that the sea was dangerous, but the specific expectation of surviving it. He was shot through the head. The record is plain about this. It was done quickly. Captain Gorman later testified to that. Whether mercy was genuinely the motivation or simply the most palatable framing for official testimony is a question the record cannot answer. The body was divided immediately. The liver, dense with nutrients, the most immediately sustaining organ, was eaten raw by men who had not had food in weeks. The rest was prepared more carefully, some portions cooked, others preserved as best could be managed. It was rationed. It lasted days. And this is where the story shifts into a register harder to process than the violence itself. The men ate, and having eaten, they continued to exist on the ship together. The same men who had discussed the lottery, drawn the lots, carried out what was decided, consumed what resulted. They still had to sleep in the same space, wake in the same gray dawns, look at each other across the wreckage of the deck. The remaining cabin boys were still there, alive, watching, present at every meal in a way that had nothing to do with food. What do you say to each other in that silence? What does the eye contact mean? How does a group of men, having done what they did, continue to function as a group? The question has no clean answer. What the historical record offers instead is outcome. They survived long enough to be rescued. A passing ship spotted the spate and pulled the crew from it. Captain Gorman and his men were brought to Ireland, where they were met with a complicated mixture of horror and sympathy that the courts ultimately resolved by declining to prosecute. Survivors of impossible circumstances, the legal system decided, not murderers. Gorman carried the weight of it publicly for the rest of his life. The story circulated. People had opinions. A poet was so disturbed by the case that he wrote a long narrative work about it, published and widely read. The cabin boy, nameless in most accounts, was made briefly famous by someone else's horror on his behalf. The horror of the Francis Spate is not in its extremity. What makes this story linger is the procedure, the calm, the held vote and the drawn lots and the deliberate conversion of a child's death into a collective decision that no single person had to own. It is the horror of systems, of the way that groups of ordinary people under sufficient pressure can arrive at extraordinary cruelty through the machinery of process and walk away with their sense of themselves as reasonable men largely intact. Captain Gorman was never convicted. He lived the rest of his life in Ireland. He attended church. He grew older. He had, presumably, conversations. Somewhere in the North Atlantic, the waters that once held the drifting Francis Spate continue their ancient motion, indifferent to everything that happened above them. The ocean received what was cast into it and kept it. The question it leaves behind is simple and has no safe answer. If the lots had fallen differently, if your hand had drawn the short straw, what would you want the men around you to have done? And if your hand had drawn long, and you were the one who remained, what would you have done? Sit with that. The Francis Spate itself was eventually rescued and brought to port. The ship was repaired, returned to service, crossed other oceans. It carried other crews who did not know what the planks beneath them had witnessed. Ships are like that. They absorb what happens aboard them and reveal nothing, not to the next captain, not to the next owner, not to anyone. The wood doesn't remember. Or if it does, it keeps the secret with the same absolute indifference as the ocean that holds the dead. But courts do remember. History does. And the boy, 17 years old, name mostly lost, the short straw in his hand, the sea remembered him in the only way the sea ever remembers anyone. It kept him. By the time they cast lots for who would die next, there were only 4 of them left. August 1899, the Norwegian bark Drott was working a cargo route through the Florida Straits. Warm water, blue sky, the kind of summer crossing that makes a sailor forget the sea can be anything other than beautiful. Then the hurricane arrived. It came from the south, the way the worst Caribbean storms do, building over open ocean until it is not a weather system anymore, but something closer to an intention. When it reached the Drott, it killed the ship almost immediately, not slowly, fast and total. The hull breaking open, the crew thrown into dark, churning water, the ship disappearing below the surface with a finality that left no room for negotiation. 6 men survived the sinking. They pulled themselves onto a raft, less a vessel than a floating platform, something designed for the 30 minutes between a ship going down and a rescue arriving, not for the open ocean, not for days in August sun. The raft had no food, no fresh water. In the Florida Straits, in summer, the sun arrives like something punitive. The sea all around is salt water that kills you more efficiently the more of it you drink. The first day, they bailed water and watched the horizon for ships. The horizon returned nothing. Dehydration is a different kind of suffering than starvation. It operates faster and with less mercy. The throat seizes first, then the eyes dry and blur, then the mind begins to fragment in ways that are distinctive and disturbing to witness from outside. A man dying of thirst in extreme heat passes through coherence into a place where the ordinary rules of perception no longer apply. Things happen in the mind that the body then acts on as though real. One of the 6 men reached that threshold on the 3rd day. He began speaking in ways that didn't track. His eyes moved to things that weren't there. And then, before anyone could stop him, he was in the water, having gone over the side in some private delirium the survivors could not reconstruct, into the Florida Straits, and gone. 5 men remained. On the 4th day, one of the 5 died of exposure and thirst, a quieter death, the body simply stopping the way bodies do when they have been pushed past their final threshold. He was dead. He was there, on the raft, with 4 men who had not had water in 4 days, and who were dying in the Florida sun with no help coming from any direction they could see. What happened next was not discussed, according to survivor accounts. It was not agreed upon through the machinery of lots or a vote or any of the formal structures that other maritime disasters had used to give themselves procedural cover. It simply happened, the way desperate things happen when the mind has been reduced to its oldest and most insistent layer. The blood was warm, it was liquid. 4 men who were dying of thirst were surrounded by something that could, by the logic of bodies reduced to pure function, delay that dying. They drank, and having crossed that line, the line moved. The next day, the largest man on the raft, a German, broad-shouldered, the kind of physical presence that earns mention in historical accounts that bother with physical detail, drew the short lot. The survivors had now, deliberately and with the remnant of conscious decision-making available to men in that state, formalized what the day before had been an act of desperate impulse. They had held a lottery. They were, in their own stripped-down way, being procedurally fair. He was stabbed through the heart. Quickly, that word keeps appearing in these maritime horrors, always quickly, as though speed transforms the nature of what is being done. The blood was taken immediately. Strips of flesh were cut and eaten raw on the raft in the August sun, in the warm and beautiful water of the Florida Straits, with the horizon still empty in every direction. 2 men survived. A British steamship found them, 2 figures on a raft in the middle of the Straits, in a state the ship's crew reportedly struggled to describe afterward. The survivors were taken aboard, given water, brought to port. They told their story because they had no compelling reason not to, or perhaps because they had lost the capacity in those days on the raft to fully reconstruct what shame was supposed to feel like in relation to what had happened. The accounts are detailed, clinical in the way that the accounts of people who have survived things that shouldn't be survivable often become clinical, stripped of the emotional scaffolding, reduced to sequence and fact. What the story of the Drott offers that other maritime disasters don't is the visible progression. The documented movement from witnessing a death to drinking blood from the newly dead to formally casting lots for the next death, all within the span of a few days on a raft in open water. You can track the erosion in real time. You can watch, in the sequence of events, the specific stages at which each threshold was crossed. This is what makes it instructive in a way that is deeply uncomfortable. Most stories of human extremity present the darkness as sudden, a moment, a single terrible crossing. The draught presents it as a gradient, a series of small, almost logical steps, each one enabled by the last, each one moving the men a little further from the people they had been when the ship went down. There is no villain. There is no moment where a bad person makes a bad decision. There are just people in impossible circumstances moving along a gradient that the circumstances created and that the human animal navigated the only way it knew how. The two survivors went home. Whether they spoke of those days on the raft, at dinner tables, with family, in the quiet before sleep is not recorded. People who have been to certain places tend to keep those places quiet. The Florida Straits are warm and blue and crossed by thousands of ships every year. The water there is beautiful in August, particularly at sunset, when the light comes low across the surface and turns it the color of something worth writing a poem about. The draught is at the bottom of it. 6 men went into the water when she sank, 2 came back out. The raft is long gone. But the question it posed is not, how many days, how much thirst, how much sun, at what specific measurable point does the architecture of who you are simply stop being the relevant framework? The draught survivors knew the answer. It was 4 days. 4 days of salt water and August sun in the Florida Straits, and the architecture folds. Think about that the next time the sea looks beautiful and manageable and entirely convincingly safe. The Florida Straits carry cruise ships now, enormous floating cities with buffets and entertainment, and every comfort designed to make a person forget they are on water at all. The passengers look out from their balconies at the same stretch of ocean the draught sank in. It is beautiful. It looks like a postcard. It looks like nothing has ever happened there. The water doesn't correct them, it never does. It holds everything that has happened in it with perfect, patient silence, and it lets the next ship pass overhead without a word. 6 men went into it in 1899. 2 came back. The other 4 are still there, in water that is warm and blue and crossed every day by people who have no idea what it keeps. He was the only one still walking by the time he understood what was happening. April 3, 1890. The German schooner Johanna left Port Louis, Mauritius, bound for Melbourne, a long haul across the southern Indian Ocean, some of the most remote and volatile water on the planet. The Southern Ocean doesn't accommodate ships the way the Caribbean or the Mediterranean do. It tolerates them temporarily and then decides otherwise. The Johanna had made crossings before. The crew had experience. The cargo was routine. What came aboard in Mauritius, invisible, was not. Tropical disease exists in the spaces between things, between bodies in close quarters, between hands that touch the same ropes, between breath that circulates in a poorly ventilated forecastle where men sleep packed in the way that the maritime economy demanded. Whatever had taken hold in Mauritius, or in the particular stress of a ship moving from tropical warmth into the cold systems of the Southern Ocean, it spread quietly at first, the way these things always do, through the ship's population before anyone fully grasped what was moving through them. The first man went down with fever. High, persistent, the kind that soaks through clothing and leaves a person glassy-eyed and beyond the reach of conversation. He was moved to the forecastle and attended to. The second man followed within days. Then the third. The mate, Mr. Hagen, watched it happen in the particular sequence that someone at the unaffected margin watches a catastrophe unfold. First concern, then alarm, then the sickening recognition that the scope of what he was seeing was larger than his ability to intervene. He was healthy. He remained healthy. The disease moved around him like water around a stone, taking everyone else and leaving him standing. The men in the forecastle screamed for water. This detail appears consistently in accounts, not whispered requests, not quiet suffering, but screaming. The particular delirium of high fever in a cramped wooden space with inadequate ventilation produces a suffering that is total and loud. Hagen brought water. He moved between the men. He did what one person can do for many people when many people are dying, and one person is all there is. One by one, they stopped screaming. One by one, they stopped. Hagen was alone on a ship in the southern Indian Ocean, the only man aboard who could still move, still navigate, still perform the basic operations that kept a vessel from being entirely at the mercy of whatever the sea decided next. He was also alone with the bodies, and the bodies had to go overboard. This was not cruelty, it was the medical reality of an enclosed space with a live contagion still present. Whatever had killed the crew was still there, on the surfaces they'd touched, in the air of the spaces they'd occupied. Hagen burned what bedding could be burned, he disposed of what had to be disposed of, he threw the bodies of men he had worked alongside, young men, some barely out of their teens, full of the specific noise and energy of people who haven't yet learned that the world can simply end them, into the Southern Ocean, one by one, in whatever weather the Southern Ocean produced that day. The ocean received them without ceremony. It always does. What happened in Hagen's mind during those hours and days is not something the historical record has preserved in detail. He later gave accounts to maritime authorities in Melbourne when he somehow managed to bring the Johanna into port alone, itself a nautical achievement that deserves acknowledgement, a man single-handing a merchant vessel across some of the world's most demanding water. He answered the questions put to him. He was, by all accounts, functional. But there are things that happen to a person in that kind of solitude that do not appear in official accounts. There is the specific quality of silence on a ship designed for 20 men and currently holding 1. The sounds a vessel makes in heavy swells, the creaking, the shifting, the low groans of a hull moving through water are sounds that become human-shaped in the dark when you are the only living person for hundreds of miles in any direction. There are the spaces that used to be occupied and now aren't. The hammock that hangs still, the mug left where a man set it down before he went to the forecastle and didn't come back out. Hagen maintained course. He managed sails in conditions that would challenge a full crew. He arrived in Melbourne, tied up the Johanna at her berth, and reported what had happened to the people who needed to know. He was written about briefly. His name appears in maritime records and in newspaper accounts in Melbourne and in Germany, where the ship was registered. And then the record goes quiet, as it always does with the people history picks up and puts back down. But the image persists. 1 man, a ship built for 20. The Southern Ocean in April, when the weather is moving toward the brutal winter systems that make that stretch of water among the most consistently dangerous on the planet. The forecastle empty. The silence of a space where men had been screaming 4 days ago, a screaming so loud, so insistent, so full of the animal need for water and presence, and for someone to acknowledge that they were dying, and now nothing. Just the ship, just Hagen, just the ocean. The fear of contagion is ancient, older than germ theory, older than medicine's ability to explain what we're actually afraid of. We recognize it before we understand it. The sealed space, the invisible thing moving through it, the question of which bodies will cross which threshold. The terrible patience of something that spreads on hands, on breath, on the surfaces of everything, and chooses its victims with no apparent logic and no discernible mercy. There is a detail that Hagen reportedly never shook, according to those who knew him afterward. Not the deaths themselves, not the solitude of sailing the Johanna alone across that vast and hostile ocean. It was the screaming. The specific quality of it, men reduced by fever to that register, half coherent, half lost, calling for water and for people and for things that weren't there and never would be again. He heard it for days. He moved through it, back and forth, doing what 1 man can do. And then it stopped. All at once, the way things stop on ships when there is no one left to make noise. He said the silence after was the loudest thing he had ever heard. There is a specific kind of loneliness that belongs only to people who have been the last one left, the last survivor in a space designed for many, surrounded by evidence of the people who were there before. Not the loneliness of solitude, which is a condition a person can adjust to, can even find peace in. This is something different. This is the loneliness of aftermath, of standing in the negative space that other people's lives left behind. Hagen carried the Johanna to Melbourne through that negative space. He docked it. He filed his reports in the clipped professional language that maritime culture demands, a language deliberately designed to keep feeling at a distance from function. The authorities inspected the ship. They confirmed his account. They cleared him of any wrongdoing. He was a man who had survived, who had done his duty, who had brought the ship in. He went home eventually, or to whatever the equivalent of home was for a man who had experienced what he had experienced and was now expected to resume the shape of an ordinary life. He ate meals. He slept. He presumably answered when people asked how his voyage had gone. The southern Indian Ocean continued south of all of it, cold and immense and completely unbothered. The bodies Hagen had given to it are still there, somewhere, in water so deep and so remote that they will remain there effectively forever. The ocean doesn't mark the spot. It doesn't leave any indication that these particular men passed through this particular water and stayed. It just continues, cold and vast and silent, the way it was before the Johanna arrived and the way it will be long after every person who knew this story is gone. the silence Hagen described was the loudest thing he ever heard. Some silences are like that. They left before dawn, because people who cross illegally always leave before dawn. 2008. 33 people from the Dominican Republic climbed into a small boat on the dark side of the island and pointed themselves toward Puerto Rico, 23 miles across the Mona Passage. 23 miles. In good conditions, with a functional boat and a reliable skipper, it is a crossing of a few hours. You leave in the dark. You arrive in the light. You begin the new chapter of the life you crossed a body of water to reach. The boat had no GPS. The skipper, who had made similar crossings before and carried the quiet confidence of someone who has gotten away with something enough times to mistake luck for skill, lost his bearing in the dark. By the time the sun came up, the Dominican coast was gone and Puerto Rico had not appeared to replace it. The Mona Passage, which sits between the Caribbean Sea and the Atlantic Ocean and behaves according to the moods of both, was not the calm crossing it had been described as. The fuel ran out. This is the detail that ends everything. Not the lost bearing, which might have been corrected, not the weather, which was manageable. The fuel ran out on a boat with no sail, no radio, no GPS, and 33 people aboard. And then there was nothing to do but drift. The Mona Passage is not the middle of the ocean. It is a stretch of water with coastlines on either side, with shipping lanes, with the occasional fishing or Coast Guard vessel. But being near land and being visible to anyone on that land are different things entirely. A small boat low in the water, without radio, without flares, without any of the equipment that makes a vessel findable, it can drift in trafficked water for days without anyone seeing it, especially a boat that chose not to be seen. The sun in the Mona Passage is direct and relentless. There was no shelter aboard, no fresh water stored beyond what had been packed for a 3-hour crossing. The plan had not included a 15th day on open water. The plan had been simple, reasonable, 23 miles, a new life. The plan had not survived contact with the dark. On day 1, people managed. On day 3, the water was gone. Thirst in direct tropical sun is not a slow suffering, it accelerates, compounding against the heat and the salt spray and the physical exposure, and it produces in people a deterioration that moves faster than the mind expects. By day 5, the group of 33 had become something different from the group that had climbed into the boat in darkness. The shared aspiration, the dream of Puerto Rico, of a life somewhere with more margin in it, had been replaced by the specific and total focus of people dying by degrees. They began to die, quietly, then in groups. The bodies went overboard because a dead body in a small boat in tropical heat creates conditions that accelerate the deaths of everyone else still aboard. 1, then 2, then more. The wailing that accompanied each loss was heard by no one. The Mona Passage received it without response, as it receives everything. On day 14, the 28th person died. There were now 5 people alive on that boat, 5 people who had been without food for nearly 2 weeks and without fresh water for most of that time. 5 people whose bodies had been reduced to the final register of need, stripped of everything that was not survival. A man named Gregorio Maria Marizan was one of them. He survived. He talked to journalists afterward because the story came out, and once it came out, the talking became part of the survival, a way of continuing to exist in a world that now knew what he had done and was going to have opinions about it regardless. He described what happened on day 14 with the particular flatness of someone who has already processed the fact that the world's judgment is a thing they will carry and have decided to carry it anyway. They ate from the body, strips of flesh from the leg and chest. Marizan described the taste as fibrous, like beef, with yellow fat. He said it the way Barrett had said it on the Steelman more than a century earlier, with a matter-of-factness that is, in some ways, more disturbing than horror would be, not because he was unaffected, but because by day 14 on the Mona Passage, the vocabulary of affect had been compressed to its absolute minimum. What remained was just the report. This is what we did, this is what it was, this is how we are still alive to tell you. The 5 survivors were rescued on day 15 by a vessel that spotted them, by chance, by the particular luck that survival sometimes generates after refusing to for 2 weeks. They were brought to Puerto Rico, they were given medical care, and then, in the detail that should be allowed to sit in silence for a moment before moving past it, they were arrested. All 5, charged in connection with what had happened on day 14. They served approximately a year in jail before being released. They had crossed the Mona Passage to find a better life. They arrived in handcuffs. 27 people did not arrive at all. 27 people went overboard, one by one, across 15 days, into water that is technically classified as a maritime transit zone and is functionally the most anonymous place in the world for the people who cross it without papers, because the anonymity is the point. No documents, no record, no trail. If you die there, the ocean is your answer. Marizan came home eventually, to the Dominican Republic, to the same side of the island he had left in darkness, hoping never to return to. He had crossed the Mona Passage and come back to where he started, changed in a way that has no name that fits comfortably into any language. This story happened in 2008, in a world with satellites and Coast Guard infrastructure and cell phones. Not in 1835, not in 1877, now, or close enough to now that the world those 33 people left behind is recognizable as the one we occupy. They were ordinary people with a dream and a boat and a skipper who had done it before, and a night that looked safe enough to try. 28 of them found out what the ocean keeps. 5 of them came back to explain it. Marizan said it tasted fibrous, like beef with yellow fat. He said it the way you report a fact that belongs to a place your mind has filed carefully away, behind a door that stays closed most of the time, but not all of the time, and especially not in the dark, and especially not near water. The Mona Passage still carries people across it before dawn, smaller boats than they should be using, with less water than they need, and skippers who have done it before and would like to do it again. The ocean doesn't check credentials. It doesn't distinguish between the crossing that works and the one that doesn't until the fuel runs out and the bearing is lost and the sun comes up over water that looks the same in every direction. And then the count begins. 1, 2, 3. By the time the 15 days are done, you will know exactly what you are capable of. You will know what it tastes like, and you will carry that knowledge back across whatever ocean you manage to survive into whatever life is still waiting for you on the other side. The sea doesn't judge. It only counts. Thank you for making it to the end. If you love listening to the stories, please like and subscribe for new stories every week, shared by real people. Comment below to let me know which story disturbed you the most. Thanks again for your support.